Miami was a city of contrasts, where luxury and decadence intertwined under the blazing sun. Neon lights reflected on sleek cars, music throbbed from beachside clubs, and the rich drifted on yachts that seemed to float effortlessly against the deep blue horizon. But behind the facade of paradise, secrets brewed, eating away at the lives of those who thought they had it all. Anton and Victoria had been living in Miami for 6 years, appearing to be the epitome of a power couple. Anton was a successful entrepreneur in the tech world, owning a string of profitable startups, while Victoria, his strikingly beautiful wife, enjoyed the privileges of a high society life. She was the type of woman who turned heads wherever she went, her confidence and charm always leaving a mark. Together they were admired, envied, and seemingly untouchable. But appearances could be deceiving. Anton's days were consumed by his business ventures, leaving him little time to notice the cracks forming in their relationship. Victoria's complaints about loneliness and the monotony of their life grew more frequent, but he brushed them off as trivial. He thought the luxury cars, their oceanfront mansion, and designer wardrobes would keep her happy. That illusion began to shatter one fateful evening. Anton returned home late from a business dinner, expecting to find Victoria curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, maybe watching her favorite reality show. Instead, he was greeted by an unsettling stillness. The living room was empty, save for a half-finished bottle of champagne and 2 glasses on the coffee table. He climbed the stairs, his pulse quickening, and found her in the bedroom, scrolling through her phone, wearing nothing but a silk robe. "This evening?" he asked, trying to sound casual. She glanced up, startled but composed. "Just a quiet night with a friend," she replied, her smile almost convincing. Anton's gut twisted. "Ew," he pressed. "Christina," she answered quickly, naming one of her socialite friends. He didn't believe her, but he let it go for now. Anton couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Victoria's behavior became increasingly suspicious. She started going out more often, claiming she had charity events or social gatherings to attend. Her phone was constantly buzzing with notifications, but she always kept it face down. When he asked who she was texting, her responses were curt. "It's just Christina," she'd say with a wave of her hand. "You don't need to worry." But Anton did worry. One night, he woke up in the middle of the night to find her side of the bed empty. Groggy and disoriented, he got up and wandered through the house. He found her in the kitchen, her back turned, as she whispered into her phone. "No, he's sleeping." "Yes, last night was perfect. I can't wait to see you again," she said, her voice soft and intimate. Anton froze. She turned around abruptly, startled by his presence. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked casually, quickly ending the call. "Who was that?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Just Christina," she said again, her tone dismissive. He didn't press further, but that night he barely slept. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew rapidly, consuming his thoughts. The next day, Anton made a decision. He contacted a private investigator named Richard, a man known in elite circles for his discretion and effectiveness. "I need you to follow my wife," Anton said, sliding a photo of Victoria across the table during their meeting. Richard nodded, his expression neutral. "You'll have answers in a week, maybe less." My arms and legs had become increasingly diseased. The week felt like an eternity. Victoria continued her usual routine, but Anton couldn't look at her without imagining the worst. Every time her phone buzzed or she left the house dressed to perfection, his chest tightened. When Richard finally called, Anton's heart pounded in anticipation. They met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Richard handed him a manila envelope. "You'll want to sit down for this," Richard said. Anton opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were photos. Victoria at an upscale bar, sitting across from a man Anton didn't recognize. They were laughing, leaning in close. In another photo, the man's hand rested on hers. The last image showed them entering a boutique hotel together. "His name is Sebastian," Richard explained. "Art dealer, wealthy, influential, and not exactly clean. He's connected to some questionable circles in Miami." Anton felt the blood drain from his face. He studied Sebastian's smug expression in the photos, feeling a mix of rage and humiliation. That night, Anton confronted Victoria. "Who's Sebastian?" he asked as they sat at the dinner table. Victoria froze, her fork hovering mid-air. She quickly regained her composure and set it down. "He's just a friend," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Don't lie to me," Anton said, his voice low and steady. "I know everything." For a moment her mask slipped and panic flickered in her eyes. Then she laughed, a short, bitter sound. "And what are you going to do about it?" she asked, her voice laced with defiance. Her words stunned him. He had expected apologies, tears, perhaps even begging. Instead, she seemed almost amused. "You think you have the upper hand," he said, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "But you have no idea what I'm capable of." Victoria's smile faltered, but she didn't respond. Anton didn't sleep that night. Victoria went to bed as if nothing had happened, but Anton stayed in his study, staring at the photos Richard had given him. His mind churned with a mix of rage, humiliation, and a cold, calculating resolve. He couldn't simply confront Sebastian in a fit of jealousy. That would be playing into his hands. No. He needed to outsmart him. The next day, Anton met with Richard again. "I want everything you can find on this man," Anton said, sliding Sebastian's photo across the table. As Richard smirked. "You're not the first to ask about him. He's not exactly clean." "I don't care about rumors. I need facts, leverage," Anton replied. Richard nodded. "Give me a week." In the meantime, Anton decided to keep up appearances. He acted as though nothing had changed, greeting Victoria in the mornings with a kiss on the cheek, asking about her day, and even feigning interest in her social events. Victoria seemed to relax, believing that her husband had backed down. But Anton was watching her every move. One evening, she announced that she was meeting friends at a new art gallery. "I won't be late," she said, barely glancing at him as she left. Anton followed her. He parked a block away from the gallery and watched as she entered, wearing a fitted black dress that he hadn't seen before. A few minutes later, Sebastian arrived, stepping out of a sleek black car. They greeted each other with a kiss, intimate, too familiar. Anton gripped the steering wheel tightly, forcing himself to stay calm. He couldn't let emotions take over. The next morning, Richard called. "I've got something you'll want to see," he said. They met at Richard's office, where he handed Anton a USB drive. "This guy's into some shady stuff, illegal art deals, laundering money for criminal groups, and that's just the tip of the iceberg," Richard explained. Anton plugged the USB into his laptop and watched the videos Richard had collected. One showed Sebastian meeting with a known gangster in a private room at an upscale club. Another revealed him negotiating a deal for a stolen painting worth millions. Anton leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Sebastian wasn't just a rival. He was a liability. That evening, Anton sat across from Victoria at dinner. She was scrolling through her phone, oblivious to his piercing gaze. "How was the gallery?" he asked casually. "Lovely," she replied without looking up. "And Sebastian, did he enjoy it too?" Her hand froze mid-screaming. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet his. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Anton smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've seen the photos, Vika. I know about the hotel, the gallery, everything. But this isn't just about you and him anymore. He's dangerous." Victoria's expression shifted from defensive to wary. "What do you mean?" Anton leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Sebastian isn't just your lover. He's a criminal. And if you keep playing games with him, you'll get dragged down with him." For the first time, Victoria looked genuinely afraid. Over the next few weeks, Anton began to put his plan into motion. Using the evidence Richard had gathered, he anonymously tipped off the authorities about Sebastian's illegal dealings, but he didn't stop there. He wanted to make sure Sebastian knew who was behind his downfall. At the same time, Anton kept a close watch on Victoria. She grew increasingly restless, sensing that the walls were closing in. Her meetings with Sebastian became more discreet, and she started asking Anton questions she hadn't before. One Friday afternoon, Victoria stepped outside and went outside for an hour and a half, allowing Anton to walk deeper into the city. "Well, are you suddenly so calm about everything?" she asked one evening. Anton shrugged. "I've just decided to focus on what matters." His ambiguous answer only deepened her unease. One night, Anton received a call from Richard. "We've got movement," Richard said. "Sebastian's been trying to clean up his tracks, but he's not fast enough. The feds are closing in." Anton felt a grim satisfaction. Good. Let him sweat. But things took a darker turn when Richard called again the next day. "Sebastian knows he's being watched," Richard said, "and he suspects you're behind it. Be careful." Anton's chest tightened. He had expected retaliation, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill down his spine. That night, as he drove home, a black SUV followed him for several blocks. When he pulled into his driveway, the SUV stopped at the corner, its engine idling. Anton sat in his car, watching it through the rearview mirror, his pulse pounding. He knew this wasn't over. Anton sat in his car, staring at the black SUV. The engine hummed faintly in the quiet night, and the headlights cut through the darkness like two predatory eyes. His mind raced. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a small handgun he had purchased years ago but never had cause to use. Tonight it felt like a necessary precaution. After a tense few minutes, the SUV pulled away, its tires crunching over gravel as it disappeared into the distance. Anton exhaled shakily and stepped out of his car, scanning the street before entering the house. Victoria was in the living room, sipping wine and scrolling through her phone. She barely acknowledged him as he walked past her. "How was your day?" she asked absently, her eyes glued to the screen. "Eventful," he replied, his tone sharper than usual. She looked up, sensing his tension. "Everything okay?" "Fine," he said curtly, disappearing into his study before she could press further. The next day, Anton called Richard and told him about the SUV. "They're watching me," Anton said. "It's Sebastian's man," Richard replied. "He's spooked, and now he's trying to intimidate you. You need to stay alert. This guy doesn't play fair." Anton decided to escalate his plan. If Sebastian wanted to intimidate him, he would show that he wasn't afraid. He asked Richard to dig deeper into Sebastian's operations and identify anyone in his network who could be flipped. Richard didn't disappoint. Within days, he found a disgruntled employee at one of Sebastian's galleries, a young man named Miguel who had been fired for asking too many questions about the source of the artwork. Anton arranged a meeting with Miguel in a small cafe on the edge of town. Miguel was nervous, glancing over his shoulder constantly. "What do you want from me?" Miguel asked. "Information," Anton said, sliding an envelope across the table. Inside was a significant sum of cash. "Tell me everything you know about Sebastian's dealings." Miguel hesitated, but the lure of money and revenge against his former boss was too strong to resist. "He's been using the gallery to launder money for some big players," Miguel said in a hushed voice. "Paintings come in, but they're just a front. The real transactions happen in the back rooms. Cash, jewels, sometimes even weapons. The feds have been sniffing around, but Sebastian's always one step ahead. He's got connections everywhere." Anton listened intently, taking mental notes. He thanked Miguel and promised him more if the information proved useful. Meanwhile, Victoria's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She spent hours locked in the bedroom on phone calls, her voice muffled but agitated. Anton knew she was talking to Sebastian, likely trying to figure out why things were unraveling. One evening, as she sat in front of the vanity applying her makeup, Anton stood in the doorway, watching her. As much as it still hurt to admit it, he was drawn to someone so young, who looked so wise. And that in cold blood. "Another night out?" he asked. He caught his reflection in the mirror and smirked. "Don't wait up." Anton's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. As soon as she left, he called Richard. "She's meeting him tonight," Anton said. "I want you to follow her." Richard trailed Victoria to a luxury penthouse in downtown Miami. The building was owned by one of Sebastian's shell companies. Victoria entered through the private elevator, and Richard captured everything on camera. Anton received the footage the next morning. Watching Victoria laugh and embrace Sebastian in the penthouse suite felt like a knife twisting in his gut. But instead of anger, Anton felt a strange sense of calm. Every move they made was another step toward their downfall. Sebastian's paranoia reached its peak a week later when federal agents raided one of his galleries. The operation was swift and efficient, leading to the seizure of numerous counterfeit artworks and unregistered firearms. Sebastian, however, was not there. Anton learned of the raid through the news, watching the footage with grim satisfaction. But his satisfaction was short-lived. That evening, as he returned home, he found the front door slightly ajar. His pulse quickened as he entered the house, gripping the handgun he now carried with him at all times. Then he saw the living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, papers scattered. "Victoria?" he called out, his voice echoing through the empty house. There was no response. He searched the entire house, but she was nowhere to be found. On the kitchen counter, he found a note scrawled hastily in her handwriting. "I had no choice. Don't try to find me." Anton's chest tightened as he read the words. He knew this wasn't over. Anton stood in the silence of the kitchen, staring at the note. His thoughts raced. The wrecked living room, the ominous message, everything pointed to one person: Sebastian. He had underestimated how far Sebastian would go to protect himself. As a result, there would be ways more downside than he could handle. Calling Rishad, Anton quickly explained the situation. She's gone and the house has been trashed. I think Sebastian has her, Anton said, his voice tight with anger. You need to stay calm, Richard replied. If he's taken her, it's leverage. He knows you've been behind his recent troubles. This is his way of sending a message. Then I'll send one back, Anton growled. Richard hesitated. Anton, you're dealing with a dangerous man. Let me handle this. No, Anton said firmly. This is personal now. The next morning, Anton reviewed everything he had on Sebastian. Photos, videos, connections, deals. He reached out to Miguel, the ex-employee, who had more to say after the raid on the gallery. Sebastian has a safe house on the outskirts of the city, Miguel said during their call. It's where he goes when things get too hot. It's not registered to him, but I know he uses it. If he's keeping someone there, it's likely off the grid. Anton didn't waste time. He passed the address to Richard, who promised to gather intel. By nightfall, Richard had confirmation. The house is heavily guarded, Richard reported. 2 men at the entrance, another patrolling the perimeter. If she's there, we'll need to move carefully. Anton's jaw clenched. We're not waiting. Tonight. Under the cover of darkness, Anton and Richard approached the safe house. Richard had brought along 2 of his most trusted operatives, men who specialized in situations like this. The house was modest, tucked behind dense palms and hidden from the road. Through binoculars, Anton spotted Victoria in an upstairs window. She was sitting on a chair, her hands bound in front of her face pale but alert. Sebastian's voice reached them faintly through the night air. He was pacing the living room, barking orders into a phone. He's nervous, Richard whispered. The raid rattled him. Anton nodded. Good. Let's make it worse. Richard's team moved swiftly, taking out the guards at the entrance with silent precision. Anton followed closely, his heart pounding as they breached the front door. Sebastian turned, startled, as the team stormed the living room. Well, well, Sebastian said, recovering quickly. If it isn't the husband. Anton leveled his gun at Sebastian's chest. Where is she? Anton demanded. Does she make it out? Sebastian smirked. Upstairs. She came willingly, you know. Said she was tired of playing house with you. Anton's grip on the gun tightened, but Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. Focus, Richard said quietly. One of the operatives headed upstairs to retrieve Victoria, while Anton kept his gun trained on Sebastian. You've lost, Anton said. The raid. The evidence. Your empire is crumbling. Said a swallow. Sebastian's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. You think this is over? He sneered. You've won nothing. I'll rebuild, and your wife, she'll come back to me. Anton's temper snapped. He stepped closer, the barrel of the gun inches from Sebastian's face. You're never coming near her again, Anton growled. Before Sebastian could respond, the sound of footsteps on the stairs drew their attention. Victoria appeared, escorted by the operative. Her face lit up with relief when she saw Anton. Anton, she whispered, her voice trembling. Sebastian seized the distraction, lunging for a hidden knife on the table, but Richard was faster, tackling him to the ground. The knife clattered to the floor as Sebastian struggled beneath Richard's weight. It's over, Richard said, pinning Sebastian's arms behind his back. Anton rushed to Victoria, cutting the ropes around her wrists. Are you okay? He asked, his hands trembling as he cupped her face. She nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I didn't think you'd find me. I'll always find you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sebastian was handed over to the authorities, his criminal empire dismantled piece by piece. Victoria, shaken but safe, returned home with Anton. But the events of the past few weeks had left deep scars. Their relationship, already fragile, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Pope smiled. I don't know how we come back from this, Anton admitted one night as they sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy. Victoria looked down, her hands twisting nervously. I didn't think you'd fight for me, she said softly. Exinity. I wasn't fighting for you, Anton said bluntly. I was fighting to stop him. There's a difference. Her face crumpled at his words, but she didn't argue. Anton and Victoria's home, once a haven of modern luxury, now felt suffocating. The silence between them was palpable, thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. The events of the past weeks had stripped away their pretenses, leaving behind raw wounds that neither knew how to heal. Victoria spent most of her time in the bedroom, avoiding Anton. She claimed she needed rest, but Anton knew better. She was retreating, consumed by her own guilt and fear. Meanwhile, Anton threw himself into damage control, working with Richard to ensure that Sebastian's associates couldn't retaliate. But the calm didn't last long. One evening, Anton received an envelope slid under the front door. Inside was a single photo of Victoria, taken through their bedroom window. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out at the ocean. No note, no sender. Anton's blood ran cold. He immediately called Richard, who arrived within the hour. "Oh," she said, dropping the phone. "This isn't over," Anton said, showing him the photo. Richard examined it, his expression grim. "This is a warning. Someone wants you to know they're watching." "But Sebastian is behind bars," Anton said. "Sebastian has friends," Richard replied, "and they're probably not happy about what happened." That night, Anton installed cameras around the house and hired a private security team to patrol the property. He didn't tell Victoria about the photo. He didn't want to alarm her. But she wasn't as oblivious as he thought. "You're acting strange," she said as they sat down for dinner. It was the first time they'd eaten together in days. "Just being cautious," Anton replied. Victoria studied him, her fork hovering over her plate. "Do you think this is over?" "No," he admitted, "and neither should you." For the first time in weeks, her facade cracked. "I'm scared, Anton," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize what I was getting into with him. I thought... She trailed off, shaking her head. "You thought what?" Anton pressed. "I thought I could control it," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't know he'd go this far." Her vulnerability disarmed him. For a moment he felt the pull of the woman he had once loved so deeply, but the anger and betrayal lingered like a shadow that refused to dissipate. The next morning Anton woke to the sound of glass shattering. He grabbed the handgun from his bedside table and ran downstairs. The living room window had been smashed, and a brick lay amidst the shards. Attached to it was a piece of paper with a simple message. "This isn't over." Anton clenched his jaw, the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. He called Richard, who arrived with his team shortly after. "This is escalating," Richard said, pacing the room. "Whoever this is, they're getting bolder. We need to find out who's behind it and shut it down. Start with Sebastian's known associates," Anton said. "There's no way this isn't connected to him." The adults got to their feet. Richard nodded. "I'll dig deeper, but you need to be prepared for anything." That evening, Anton and Victoria had another tense dinner. He debated whether to tell her about the brick, but decided against it. She was already on edge, and he needed her calm. "It's from a friend," he explained. But Victoria surprised him. "I know something's going on," she said, breaking the silence. "Don't lie to me, Anton." He hesitated before answering. "Someone's trying to send a message. It's connected to Sebastian." Her face paled. "Do you think they'll come for me?" "I won't let that happen," Anton said firmly. For the first time, Victoria reached across the table and took his hand. "I know I've made mistakes," she said, her voice trembling. "But I need you to believe me when I say I never wanted any of this. I didn't know what kind of man he was." Anton looked at her, his emotions a chaotic mix of anger, pity, and something he couldn't quite name. "I don't know if I can believe anything you say," he admitted. Her hand fell away and she looked down at her plate, her shoulders slumping. That night, Anton sat in his study, reviewing Richard's latest report. Sebastian's network was larger than they had initially thought, with ties to organized crime spanning multiple cities. But one name stood out, a man known only as Victor, a fixer and enforcer who handled Sebastian's dirtiest work. After perusing the notes and scanning Sebastian's equipment, Sebastian and Anton drew up plans to beat. Richard had found Victor's location, a nightclub in Miami's seedy underbelly. "I'll go," Anton said when Richard suggested sending his team. "That's not a good idea," Richard warned. "This guy is dangerous." "I'm not sitting back while my wife and I are being threatened," Anton said. The nightclub was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and the scent of cheap liquor. Anton entered, his heart pounding but his expression calm. He spotted Victor almost immediately, a hulking figure seated in a private booth, surrounded by a group of men who looked just as dangerous as he did. Anton approached cautiously, his hands steady despite the tension coursing through him. "Victor," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm serious." Victor looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Who's asking?" "My name is Anton," he said. "We need to talk." Victor smirked, leaning back in his seat. "You've got guts coming here, Anton. What makes you think I won't have my men throw you out? Or worse?" "Because I know you work for Sebastian," Anton said. "And I know you're the one behind the threats." I grabbed his coffee cup and tossed it to the floor. Victor's smirk faltered for a brief moment before he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You think you're smart," Victor said, "but you don't know what you're messing with." "Then educate me," Anton replied, his voice steady. Victor leaned back in his chair, a dark grin spreading across his face. He gestured for one of his men to leave, clearly signaling that this conversation was not meant for outsiders. The others stayed, their presence an unspoken warning to Anton. The nearby car had returned to where Victor went to take his stand next to his father and poke him in the stomach with his finger. "You've got nerve walking in here like you own the place," Victor said, lighting a cigar. "But guts don't always equal brains." Anton ignored the taunt. He leaned closer, locking eyes with the enforcer. "We've been leaving messages," Anton said. "Watching my wife. Breaking into my house. I want it to stop. Now." Victor exhaled a plume of smoke, his expression unreadable. "And what if I don't?" Anton pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. With a single tap, a video began playing. It was footage of Victor, taken at one of Sebastian's art gallery meetings, clearly discussing logistics for moving stolen goods. Victor's grin faded. "You think I'm bluffing?" Anton asked. "This video, along with everything else I have on you, is sitting with someone I trust. If anything happens to me or my wife, it all goes straight to the FBI." Victor's jaw tightened, his gaze darting to his men before returning to Anton. "You've got balls, I'll give you that," Victor said, his voice low and threatening. "But this isn't just about you and your wife. Sebastian's people don't like loose ends, and you've made yourself one hell of a target." "I'm not scared of Sebastian," Anton shot back. "He's in prison, his empire is crumbling, and the feds are breathing down your neck. You think he could protect you? He's already finished." Victor leaned forward, his face inches from Anton's. "You don't know what you're talking about. Sebastian's reach goes further than you think. He's not done, and if you keep pushing, you'll regret it." Anton didn't flinch. "If he's still pulling strings, I'll cut them, starting with you." "Hey." The two men stared each other down, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Victor leaned back, blowing out a slow stream of smoke. "You've got guts, Anton, I'll give you that. But guts only take you so far. Tucking and picking and shredding. As an art, I can understand." He gestured for his men to stand down, a sign that the confrontation, for now, was over. "I'll tell you this much," Victor added. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, and when the stings come, don't say I didn't warn you." Anton left the nightclub with a mix of adrenaline and unease. He had faced down Victor, but the enforcer's parting words lingered in his mind. He didn't doubt that Sebastian's network was still alive, and the threats would only escalate. The drive home was tense, his grip on the steering wheel tight as he replayed the confrontation in his head. When he pulled into the driveway, he noticed a car parked across the street, its headlights off but its silhouette unmistakable. Anton stepped out of his car, his handgun tucked discreetly in the back of his waistband. He approached the house cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement. Inside, the house was dark, but Victoria was awake, sitting in the living room with a glass of wine in hand. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice strained. "Taking care of something," Anton replied, his tone clipped. Victoria set the glass down and stood. "I need to know what's happening, Anton. You're keeping me in the dark and it's making me crazy." He hesitated, debating how much to tell her. Finally, he relented. "There's a man named Victor," Anton said. "He's one of Sebastian's people, and he's been behind the threats. I confronted him tonight." Her face paled. "Confronted him? Are you insane? He could have killed you." "Maybe," Anton said, shrugging. "But I couldn't just sit back and wait for them to come to us." Victoria's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the couch. "Anton, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I didn't know what Sebastian was capable of. I didn't know—" "You didn't care," Anton interrupted, his voice cold. "You thought you were playing some harmless game, but now we're both paying the price." Her tears spilled over, but Anton turned away, too consumed by his anger to offer her comfort. Later that night, as Anton sat in his study reviewing Richard's latest updates, his phone buzzed with a new message. The sender was anonymous, but the content was clear. a photo of Anton and Victoria's house, taken from the same angle as the earlier surveillance photo. Below it was a single line. "You can't protect her forever." Anton's stomach churned with rage. He called Richard immediately, relaying the message. "They're escalating," Richard said grimly. "This isn't intimidation anymore. They're preparing for something bigger." "We need to end this," Anton said. "Whatever it takes." "Elux." "I'm working on it," Richard replied. "But be careful, they're watching your every move." In the days that followed, Anton's paranoia grew. Every shadow, every parked car, every unfamiliar face felt like a threat. The security team he had hired worked around the clock, but the tension in the house was unbearable. Victoria barely left her room, and Anton threw himself into planning his next move. Then came the breaking point. One evening, Anton returned home to find the front door ajar again. He stormed inside, calling for Victoria, but the house was silent. In the living room, a single object lay on the coffee table. A USB drive. Anton plugged it into his laptop, his hands shaking. The video that played made his blood run cold. It was footage of Victoria, bound and gagged in a dimly lit room. A man's voice spoke off camera. She crouched on the floor and stared at her ex. "You have 48 hours to come to the location we'll send. If you don't, she dies." Anton stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest, as Victoria's muffled sobs echoed through the speakers. The dim room where she was held captive was unrecognizable, devoid of clues about her location. The man's voice, calm, calculated, and dripping with menace, replayed in his head. "You have 48 hours to come to the location we'll send. If you don't, she dies." His phone buzzed almost immediately with a text message from an unknown number. The message was short. "Come alone, no police, no games." Anton clenched his fists, his mind racing. They wanted him vulnerable, without backup or leverage, but they underestimated him. The first call he made was to Richard. "She's been taken," Anton said, his voice tight with urgency. "Send me the video," Richard replied immediately. "I'll run it through filters and try to pinpoint our location. We've got less than 48 hours to get this right." Anton forwarded the file and began preparing. He pulled out the handgun he'd been carrying and checked the ammunition, then packed a bag with essentials: cash, a burner phone, and a small tracking device Richard had given him earlier. When Richard called back, his tone was grim. "The room has no obvious markers, but the audio gives us something. I ran the background noise through a filter. There's a faint echo of waves, probably close to the docks. There's also a factory whistle in the background. That narrows it down to the industrial district near Port Miami." Anton's jaw tightened. "That's where I'll start." "I'll have my team nearby," Richard said. "But remember, they don't want you to bring anyone. If they suspect you're not alone, they'll kill her." "I won't risk her life," Anton said, "but I won't walk in blind either." The next 24 hours were a blur of preparation. Anton didn't sleep, his mind focused solely on saving Victoria. Despite everything, the betrayal, the lies, the pain, he couldn't let her die. Hughes discarded her and offered to help her wait as he started the GM proof. By the time the kidnappers sent the location, he was ready. The address led to an abandoned warehouse near the docks, a sprawling, decrepit structure surrounded by rusted fences and overgrown weeds. The perfect place for someone to disappear. Anton arrived just before midnight, parking his car a block away and approaching on foot. He wore a hidden earpiece connected to Richard, who monitored the situation from a distance. "Keep your phone on silent," Richard whispered through the earpiece. "I'll guide you if things go south." As Anton stepped inside the warehouse, the air felt heavy, saturated with the scent of oil and salt water. Dim light flickered from a single bulb hanging in the center of the room. "Anton," Victoria's voice, muffled but unmistakable, called out from the shadows. She was tied to a chair in the middle of the room, her face streaked with tears. A figure stepped out of the darkness. "Victor." "You really are predictable," Victor said, his smile a cruel slash across his face. "I was hoping you'd come." Anton's eyes darted around the room, spotting two other men flanking Victor, both armed. "Let her go," Anton said, his voice steady despite the rage coursing through him. Victor chuckled. "And miss out on the fun? You've been a thorn in my side, Anton. But tonight, that ends." Anton's hand hovered near his waistband, ready to draw his gun, but Victor raised his hand, stopping him. "Ah," Victor said, "try anything, and she dies first." Anton's mind raced, searching for a way to turn the situation in his favor. "You think killing me solves anything?" Anton said, buying time. Sebastian is finished. The feds are dismantling his empire piece by piece. You're just another loose end. Victor's smirk wavered, but he quickly recovered. You talk too much. In that moment, the faintest sound crackled in Anton's earpiece. Richard's voice. Distraction incoming in 5, 4... Anton braced himself, his hand tightening around the gun. Suddenly, an explosion shattered the silence. The windows of the warehouse rattled as a blinding flash lit up the night. Smoke poured into the room, creating chaos. Anton moved instinctively, drawing his gun and firing at one of Victor's men, who crumpled to the ground. A second man hesitated, coughing and disoriented, giving Anton the opening he needed. Victor grabbed Victoria, pulling her up as a shield. "Drop the gun or I'll kill her," Victor shouted, his voice panicked. Anton's heart pounded as he aimed his weapon, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Let her go," Anton said, his voice cold. Victor's grip on Victoria tightened, his eyes darting around as Richard's team stormed the warehouse. Realizing he was outnumbered, Victor shoved Victoria forward and made a run for it. Anton caught Victoria as she stumbled, her sobs racking her body. Plancher crunched beneath his weight, trying to keep up. "It's okay," he whispered, holding her tightly. "I've got you." Richard's men pursued Victor, cornering him in an alley outside the warehouse. Shots rang out, and moments later Richard's voice came through the earpiece. "Bring it down. It's over." Anton exhaled, the weight of the past days crashing down on him. He looked at Victoria, her tear-streaked face buried against his chest, and felt an overwhelming mix of relief and exhaustion. But he knew this wasn't truly the end. Back at their house, Victoria sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Anton poured 2 glasses of whiskey, setting one in front of her. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice shaky. Anton stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "This isn't about gratitude, Victoria. It's about survival, and you need to understand something." She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "I'll always protect you," he said. "But trust? That's something you'll have to earn back, and I don't know if you can." Victoria's lip quivered, but she nodded, understanding the finality in his tone. As Anton stood, he looked out the window, the faint glow of the city lights in the distance. He knew the battle was over, but the scars it left would remain. For now, he had his life back, but the cost, that would haunt him forever.